Ready.
Hmm. Hello, my friend.
Hello. I love the chimes.
Yeah, the chimes were calling to be called on today.
Very good.
So, this is a bamboo um, chime, and it is, oh, kind of calibrated to air. So, kind of a
Ooh.
lightness of being.
Feels very feminine.
Hmm.
Very feminine energetically.
I wonder if there's something important about that feminine energy today, Julie.
Well, funny you would ask.
Tell me
So
everything.
I have a really sweet unfolding of today's poem and how it found me, which I'm very delighted to share that with you today.
I think that's almost as exciting as the poem itself is how the poems find us.
I totally agree because I went in another direction, or I was just naturally in a different direction. And through my inbox, I received a newsletter I guess it was over the weekend. And it was from Matthew Fox. And Matthew Fox is an American priest who comes out of the Dominican, I think it's Dominican, priesthood, but he actually was expelled from the priesthood. And he is I think, one of the most beautiful theologian voices in the world. I really enjoy his take on spirituality, which is a departure and a break from the Catholic Church in many, many ways, and yet also very historically respectful of where he comes from, the world in which he comes. And I really enjoy his newsletters that I have been subscribing to for a couple of years because he always frames what's happening, social activism in the world today, with the wisdom keepers, the ancestors, who have
Mm.
so much to offer us. And so I particularly enjoy and love his style of doing that work. And so Matthew Fox is offering a course through his website on the work of Thomas Aquinas.
Yes.
And I have always been sort of, intrigued by that and sort of like, oh, I would love to take that training. And so I went to check it out and, see if it's in the budget and what the time commitment and all that is. And that took me down a rabbit hole. But it took me down a rabbit hole of really understanding that, Thomas Aquinas lived during the Black Plague. So he has much to offer us in wisdom about what it is to live through such a dark historical time. And he has written beautiful poetry. So I was very much enticed, excited, thrilled to find the work of Thomas Aquinas. And
Mm.
I did find said poem that I was prepared to read today. Very
Oh.
excited. But today is the feast day of Mary Magdalene. And I thought, no, Thomas, we need a voice. We need a feminine voice. We need a
Mm.
female voice of the wisdom keepers, of the ancestors today, especially on this feast day of Mary Magdalene. And that sent me down a different trail. And so I decided that we needed an unruly, revolutionary mystic to be represented today on this feast day. And so I am going to introduce you to potentially somebody you're not as familiar with. We will find out, because I am going to introduce you to Hildegard of Bingen, who is a 12th century nun who lived to be 81 years old during that time period of 1098 to 1179, which those dates don't even seem like that we have a woman revolutionary leader in that time period who has left us with an amazing body of work. And I thought, yes, Hildegard needs to be represented today. So, have you heard of her before?
You know, this much, Julie.
Okay,
So, I
then I'm
love
very
this.
excited.
I love how Matthew led you to Thomas Aquinas, who said, you know, there's really someone I'd like for you to meet.
Exactly. There's someone else who needs, which goes back to this this statement that Patrick Otuma, who we met last time, talks about. In the Tibetan culture, there's a word called mu that is used when there's a better question to be asked.
Mm.
You say, mu, and that's the sort of heads up that that's not the right question. Reframe the better question. And so that was sort of the, there's a better voice for today. There's a, I'll wait my turn. But Hildegard needs to be heard today on this feast
Hildegard.
day of Mary Magdalene.
Yes.
So a little bit about her. She has this fascinating life history, and it starts in Germany. So she is born in Germany. She becomes a Benedictine abbess for the monastery that she eventually becomes the founder of and lives out the rest of her life. But that's a little bit of a side note. She was a naturalist. She was a writer, a prolific writer in a time when women were not educated. So she had the luck of being like one of 10 children, and eventually a parent sort of gives her to like she becomes a tithing basically to a woman who is, I would say, before it was a founded nunnery, was a woman who was living a very kind of austere spiritual life. And they sort of gave their daughter to this woman in hopes that she would educate her, basically feed her, and they would be in good graces with the church because they had given this child in a spiritual life. And so this woman does teach her to read, which was a life-changing skill for her to learn. And she took that skill and she became a poet, an amazing artist, a prolific writer. She leaves us with books on the natural world that did not exist in this time period. She was the author of the beginnings of some of these sort of observations in nature. She learned about natural medicines and how to use herbs and how to use these things medicinally. And she created these medical journals that were then used and passed on. She had this remarkable contribution to something called polyphony, which is a style of music that has to do with almost like call and repeat chanting. And so this is the first time that we see music taken out of the church, and it's music that is now part of, the part of the world. It's not just, it's secular. It's no longer part of just Gregorian chant. And yet when she would do her chores and things, as a young nun, she would listen to Gregorian chanting coming from like the neighboring monastery and put her own words to that. So she's sort of this radical sort of,
She has planted so many seeds.
so many
seeds.
So she was this very talented, very smart, very cagey in a way. She knew, as a woman who'd kind of risen eventually into a leadership position as an abbess in charge of a group of women, that was, first of all, highly unusual. And she's living during, the Middle Ages. She's living on the tail end of some pretty dark times, and certainly a very patriarchal dominated change, and the feminine face of God was definitely not on the table in many ways. And however, she was incredibly savvy. She was incredibly enlightened, to the point that she was a mystic, that she would get these downloads from God. She would have these amazing sort of insights and experiences, and priests and leadership, including 2 popes during her lifetime, like couldn't quite ignore her. They may have wanted to. And she did get some back, draft as a result of some of her beliefs, but she was strong. She stood up to the patriarchy at a pretty dear cost to herself sometimes. But, she had that sort of fire in her belly because she was educated, because she did know what she knew, and because of who she was in her person. She did get a lot of respect from the dominant male culture within the church in her day. And so I loved some of those stories about that with her. She, as a young girl, had an experience out in nature where a bright light sort of like kind of appeared before her and sort of encompassed her. And she had a spiritual awakening, is the best thing to call it. And again, when she was in her 40s, that same spiritual awakening kind of direction came, which was, you need to be documenting and publishing this information that is coming through you. And she sort of fought it at first, because that would have been very radical in her time for a woman to be thinking she could be writing books and being involved in changing the structure of how music is performed within the church, or even outside of the church, taking it outside of the church. And she tried to kind of ignore it at first. But it was like, when you've been tapped, it's like, we can do this the easy way, or we can do this the hard way. And so she finally understood that, I need to honor the spiritual direction that I am being given. And she did. And that's when her clairvoyant gifts, I guess, that is when all of that finally really strengthened in a way that she could not be dismissed, because she was so spot on in her prophecies. And again, back to that whole, they may have wanted to marginalize her, and there were priests who certainly stalled her out as much as they could, but she was fierce and she was strong. And she was She had courage. She had a very courageous heart. And I think that's something that I really like resonate
Mm-hmm.
and respond to her. So
I
let's
love
see.
this image of her standing in her sacred space without fear of being, even though she was being judged, she wasn't fearful of the judgment because she
Mhm.
had faith and trust in her sacred self.
Yes. And she knew she reported to a higher authority, and she like embodied that, definitely.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so let's see what else is really exciting. So she produced is this body of work called the Scivias, and this is in Latin, and it's it's this collection of, what's the best way to describe it? It's like this collection of like spiritual rules for living. And
Mm-hmm.
I think there were a bunch of them, like 26 of them or something. And these for her were downloads that she received. And she even drew, she's an amazing artist on top of everything else. And there's these beautiful illustrations in this book that she has created. And this is like a 600 page book. This is many, many years of her life working on this sort of spiritual download that she needed to put together. That in itself, if that's all she had accomplished, that would be pretty awesome undertaking. But she wrote so many Gregorian chant, sort of chamber music, beautiful, beautiful music that is performed today still. I mean, it's just this amazing body of work. She wrote poetry. She wrote science-based, like I had said earlier about, she was very much a naturalist and really did not separate science and spirituality. And this was something that was the ongoing issue between church, was the separation of science and spirituality. She believed very much that they were partners in crime, that they went together, they should not be separate. um, and she wrote a play about virtues that I guess was like this wildly wonderfully performed play that really still stands the test of time. So I found that fascinating about her. She's written so many symphonies. That's another, I mean, just
Wow.
another skill set. And then like in kind of her 70s was finishing up like a second and a third publication that was really based on her visionary works. And still, remember, she's an abbess
Right.
who travels around the region
Hmm.
preaching because she's so almost like rock star popular. And it was crushing the community she lived in when all these people would converge because they wanted to have time with Hildegard, and there was no lodging, there wasn't enough food. So she had to start going out to the people to. So for 14 years, she traveled around the region, preaching and sharing her story. And that, and again, in itself was like the church had to kind of let her do it because she had so much fandom, and because of the fans there was money coming into the coffers
Right.
of her abbey in particular,
Yep.
but it was filtering. So um, I found that fascinating too, to see, follow the money trail, and you'll know how people will kind of like leave you alone and let you do your thing. And so she lived this amazing life. And because of her life and her contribution, flocks of women, young women, wanted to join her particular order and live and study under her. And so when she died at age 81, I think she had like 80 or more nuns living within that monastery, studying and working. That's pretty substantial for that time period that she lived.
Yeah.
So that takes us up to about, again, let's remember, like 1171. Like, this is like this is the 12th century that this is happening. And so that's a little bit of her story, just to give you a taste. There's so much to learn about her. But I wanted to give you that little taste and then share with you actually two of her poems. It was hard for me to choose. And so the first one is called Antiphon for the Angels. And Antiphon is it's like a short sequence that can be sung, that is usually read after a psalm is read. It's sort of like a call and repeat kind of.
Okay.
That's my understanding. And so it begins. Spirited light, on the edge of the presence, your yearning burns in the sacred darkness. O angels, insatiably into God's gaze. Perversity could not touch your beauty. You are essential joy. But your lost companion, angel of the crooked wings, he sought the summit, shot down the depths of God, and plummeted past Adam, that a mud-bound spirit might soar. Now imagine, this originally was written in Latin. So it has been translated, but that's the English translation to the Latin, the original in Latin. And when I read that part about that a mud-bound spirit might soar, it made me think of you and your discussion of mud on your wings.
Yes.
Yeah.
Mud-bound spirit may soar, and I could see the spirit emerging from the mud.
And what you get so strongly is she had a reverence for God and for spirituality, but the feminine face of God. It's so clear. Like, she wasn't caught up in the patriarchal version of spirituality. And then the next reading that I want to do is it's a very short one, but I just loved this, and it's called O Most Noble Greenness, Rooted in the Sun.
Oh.
And again, this one was written in Latin, and it's been converted to English, and it goes like this. O most noble greenness, rooted in the sun, shining forth in streaming splendor upon the wheel of earth. No earthly sense of being can comprehend you. You are encircled by the very arms of divine mysteries. You are radiant like the red of dawn. You glow like the incandescence of the sun. So, just these are words from a woman living in the 12th century.
There is I could feel this warmth when you read this poem, and this warmth coming from within and being surrounded by it.
Yeah. So there are many more. It was hard to narrow down, but these two just sort of grabbed me and made their presence like wanted to be read today. So I will continue. There's so much more I want to read and learn about her, because I'm just totally fascinated by again, the historical context of this woman's body of work,
Right.
and that she was left alone for the most part. There was one time in her life where she allowed a man who had been denied burial within the church grounds, who knows for what reason, but she had him buried there on, sacred, consecrated ground because she believed it was the right thing to do. And in punishment, the church did not allow her to receive the sacrament of communion for a long time. And that was like the most harsh thing they could do, is
Mm.
restrict her ability to receive the body of Christ through the sacraments. And she was like able to sort of like thumb her nose at them, to the point that she continued to grow in fame and adoration and respect. And finally the church, like, fine, okay, she can receive the sacraments.
You
And she
know,
was like, I don't care.
I would be curious about her creative endeavors during that time. Just,
Of when, yeah,
I'm just
when she was sort of
curious.
restricted.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I'm just curious during that time when she was denied this sacrament. Um, I just had this feeling that it had the opposite effect, which was,
It did. And because the next thing that I read, and I think it was through something that Matthew Fox had actually written, which was, what would Hildegard think of the church today? Kind of like, and he said she was very vocal in her day of saying, the priesthood, you are all corrupt. So let's just be honest here, because the reality is you're greedy, you're in it for money, you're not living a spiritual life. You're not following the Benedictine sort of philosophy at the time, which was less about adoration of God and more about social action.
right,
What are you doing in your communities?
right,
And so I think she probably thought, yeah, whatever, take your sacraments. I got a direct line here.
right, right.
I don't need the illusion that you are putting forth, that you're the interceptor for anything.
And
That's
that,
my take.
well, that's very important of not needing an interceptor or a mediator. Is
Mm-hmm.
she had a direct line, and she used that direct line for
Yeah.
wisdom and guidance. And
Mm-hmm.
then she shared
Yeah.
with no expectation of teaching people to be a certain way. She simply shared and put it out into the world for people
Mm-hmm.
to take what they needed and leave what didn't resonate with them.
Mm-hmm.
That's
And
just
very
my feeling.
much, yeah, and very much lived in that space of, this is coming through me for you. That's the
Yes.
difference too, of not having ego
Yes.
around this whole thing.
Of being in
Yeah.
service.
Mm-hmm. Being in
Um,
service.
it's not about me. This is about the collective.
Yeah.
Oh, Julie, this is so lovely for this time that we are living in right now.
Mm-hmm.
Hmm.
Yeah, we needed to turn to the ancestors, the wisdom keepers, and remember
Yep.
that these people did hard things. They lived through hard times. They lived through lack of food, lack of medicines, lack of a lot of resources, and still found beauty, still found their way to contribute, still made meaning of the shadow, the dark times.
Hmm. Yep.
And I needed that. I needed that reminder very much.
I have to tell you, during our conversation today, I have had this shift in perspective about the rabbit hole. because the rabbit hole, we talk
Hmm.
about going down the rabbit hole. And for me, the rabbit hole is this place where I get lost and I feel like I'm literally underground. I can't see in front of me. I get overwhelmed. It all just goes to pot. But in our conversation today, Julie, the rabbit hole feels like a place of discovery.
Hmm.
Instead of a place to get lost, it feels like a place of discovery. So now I want to be in the rabbit hole. I want to go down that rabbit hole
I love it.
without, being in the rabbit hole without concern of how am I going to get out of here, but being in the
Hmm.
rabbit hole of whatever turn or alleyway I take is where I'm supposed to be. And
Right.
what
It's stay
is there
curious.
to meet me?
Hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Stay curious because it's fun how these things sort of play out. So, but we're not quite done because I'm reading this beautiful work by Hildegard and enjoying that discovery. And then, of course, I'm thinking about it being, the feast day of Mary Magdalene and wondering not so much if there's poetry written by Mary Magdalene, because we just don't have a body of work that we can really refer to. And maybe there is more through like the Gnostic Gospels or something, but
Hmm.
that was not the purpose. It was just a matter of, I wonder if there's any poetry out there in response to today being the feast
Oh,
day for Mary
sure.
Magdalene. So I did a little Google search, which took us to our friend Patrick, and he is getting ready to do a workshop with a woman named Marie Howe, Howe.
Okay.
And in the multiple description of this workshop, I saw Mary Magdalene's name. And I was like, whoa, what's that all about? So it was just this brief line about an exploration of Mary Magdalene. So I thought Marie Howe must be a Mary Magdalene person. So I went and Googled Marie Howe's name, and boop, it pulls up that Marie Howe is an American poet and the oldest of 9 children, very Catholic family. I think she said she has like 100 first cousins. So big Catholic family. And she has done some she's done amazing poetry. She's been a teacher at the professor level in university as well as a grade school, like high school level teacher in her career, and is a full-time poet at this stage of her life.
Mm.
And says that the roots of a poem can never be pulled out completely
Mm.
because the roots of poem come from sacred soil. And I just loved that imagery. And I thought, oh my gosh, this is going to be a whole other woman to study. But I do want to give you the poem Magdalene, The
Ah,
Seven Devils by Marie Howe
all right.
before we leave today, because it is the feast day and Mary of Magdalene needs her due today, I feel.
She does.
So a little bit of a backstory that in Luke 8:2 in the Bible, there's a reference to Mary called Magdalene, from whom 7 devils had been cast out. So that's kind of the biblical introduction of this character, Mary of Magdalene. And based on that line, this poem had unfolded for Marie. And it goes like this. The first was that I was very busy. The second, I was different from you. Whatever happened to you could not happen to me, not like that. The third, I worried. The fourth, envy disguised as compassion. The fifth was that I refused to consider the quality of life of the aphid. The aphid disgusted me, but I couldn't stop thinking about it. The mosquito, too, its face, and the ant, its bifurcated body. Okay, the first was that I was so busy. The second, that I might make the wrong choice because I had decided to take that plane that day, that flight before noon, so as to arrive early, and I shut. The third was that I walked past the certain place on the street, the house. If I walked past that certain place on the street, the house would blow up. The fourth was that I was made of guts and blood with a thin layer of skin lightly thrown over the whole thing. The fifth was the dead seemed more alive to me than the living. The sixth, if I touched my right arm, I had touch of my left arm, and if I touched the left arm a little harder than I'd first touched the right, then I had to retouch the left and then touch the right again so it would be even. The seventh, I knew I was breathing the expelled breath of everything that was alive, and I couldn't stand it. I wanted a sieve, a mask, I hate this word, cheesecloth, to breathe through that would trap it, whatever was inside everyone else that entered me when I breathed in. No, that was the first one. The second was that I was so busy I had no time. How had this happened? How had our lives gotten like this? The third was that I couldn't eat food if I really saw it, distinct, separate from me, in a bowl or on a plate. Okay, the first was that I could never get to the second, to the end of that list. The second was the laundry was never finally done. The third was that no one knew me, although they thought they did. And that if people thought of me as little as I thought of them, then was that love? The fourth was I didn't belong to anyone. I wouldn't allow myself to belong to anyone. The fifth was that I knew none of us could ever know what we didn't know. The sixth was that I projected onto others what I myself was feeling. The seventh was the way my mother looked when she was dying. The sound she made, her mouth wrenched to the right and cupped open so as to take in as much air, the gurgling sound so loud we had to speak louder to hear each other over it. And that I couldn't stop hearing it years later, grocery shopping, crossing the street. No, not the sound. It was her body's hunger, finally evident, what our mother had hidden all her life. For months, I dreamt of knuckle bones and roots, the slabs of sidewalk pushed up like crooked teeth by what grew underneath. The underneath, that was the first devil. It was always with me, and that I didn't think you, if I told you, would understand any of this.
Hmm. Hmm. You can't get to seven until you root yourself in one.
I love her taking this sort of modern day juxtaposition of the things that we deal with and overlaying it on, first of all, the whole thing that seven devils had been cast out of this woman, making her now, sort of a legitimate character in the caravan that was part of Jesus Christ and his work in the world. Because as a young Catholic girl growing up, we got the story of Mary Magdalene as being the prostitute. And so we had Mary Magdalene, the prostitute, and Mary the Virgin, sort of as our as our standards of womanhood to hold up to.
I always
And
felt like she was misunderstood and
yes,
misrepresented.
yeah. So
We're not
on
one or
her
the
feast
other.
day, I felt like she needed to have a poem read for her.
Oh my gosh, Julie. You're just, that rabbit hole really was a place of discovery.
It was. It was good for my soul. Yeah.
It feels that way. Yeah, I can feel it.
Mhm.
Oh, yeah, so lovely. So lovely.
Mhm.
Hmm. I'm going to just move on our way the way
Nice.
that we found our way in. The essence of Hildegard coming through the
Mhm.
chime. I can feel her uh, sweet and delicate and subtle, but she packs a punch.
Yes.
Yeah. Well,
Mhm.
Julie, thank you for bringing all of these wonderful women to us today.
My pleasure. Yeah, it was fun.
All right.
All
So
right.
until we meet again,
All
thank
right.
you.
Stay healthy.
Yes, you as well. Have a great
All
week.
right. You
Bye.
too. Bye.